representing the minorities.
I tried.
Our guest, as most of you know, began life as Siddhartha Mukherjee. He then became Dr. Siddhartha Mukherjee, and more recently he has become Pulitzer Prize winning author and filmmaker, Dr. Siddhartha Mukherjee. And I don't know how many of you have read his sparkling, iridescent, extraordinary biography of the history of cancer, Emperor of All Maladies, but if you haven't, you owe it to yourselves to do so, and there are copies outside. And we're going to talk about the book and the genesis of the book, and then Siddhartha is going to show a clip from the movie that he made with the very famous documentary maker Ken Burns. And then we're going to talk about the state of science, and also he's going to, about his new books, plural, because before the word author, he is shortly to introduce another word in his overall introduction, which is the word prolific. Sid, I don't know how you manage this all. He was telling me just now that he actually was in the hospital last night, and I have no idea at all how, first of all, you ever had the itch to pick up the pen, and second, how in this extraordinarily busy day that you must have every day of the week, you've found the time to actually write a book.
Yeah. Well, thank you for all those kind words. I think the word itch is a nice word. I think most writers, and I think most creative people do the things that they do because they can't do otherwise. I think it's just as compulsive as something itching in your back. You can't get it out until it's scratched. And so for me, that itch, at least when I was starting out, that itch was the itch that I had felt when people would come up to patients, people that I loved, people I knew, my own family members would come up to me and say, well, you're working on cancer. We just don't know anything about it. We have no idea where we are. We don't know how we got here. Give us a roadmap. And I thought to myself, well, I've spent 10 years at that point of time, 10 odd years, studying this vast subject, and there must be a roadmap. There must be a landscape. There must be a Google Doc of cancer, and I couldn't find one. There was no...
Was there anything that came close, or other people who tried it in the past?
People had tried. I mean, I would say, interestingly, people had tried both in the metaphorical sense. Susan Sontag famously, in the metaphorical sense, had tried to capture the history or the biography of an illness. There was a couple of books, not on cancer. There were a couple of books that were really important road maps for me, landmark books. I'll tell you both of them. I refer to them in the book. One was Randy Schilt's book, which ferocious book about the very first days of the AIDS epidemic and the biography of that disease. And if you haven't read it, And the Band Played On is the name of the book. I would recommend everyone, not only because it was such an important historical moment, but it's an encapsulated history of innovation and the barriers to innovation. It's an encapsulated history of what happens when human beings suddenly face the kind of cataclysm that Camus described in The Plague. The historian Tony Judt once told me, Albert Camus' book, The Plague, is about the plague in the same way that King Lear is about a king named Lear. Because, of course, formally it's about the plague, but really it's about human history and psychology and psyche and trauma and all of those other things. It all gets condensed down to a single moment when a bacterium gets unleashed into a population. So there was Randy Schilt's book, and then there was the other book that I thought was remarkable, and that was The Making of the Atomic Bomb, which I think everyone who is interested in technology today, Making of the Atomic Bomb, is also a landmark book. It is also about the making of the atomic bomb in the same way that King Lear is about a king named Lear. It is about what happened to human history, what happened to science when all of a sudden we discovered how to break open the atom. So more than any book on disease or cancer, etc., these two landmark works of nonfiction were sort of, and Susan Sontag's work, were three things that I went back to over and over again.
But you were also you had several day jobs. You were making your way as a clinician as well. And how did you find the time to compose or write the book?
You know, the nice thing about time is that you lose the memory of time. So you can you can have convenient amnesia about how you spend your time. But if I remember correctly, when I was writing the book, I would come home in the evening. We didn't have children then, which can be a lovely blessing, although, as you know,
well, it's like Evelyn Waugh said, the greatest enemy to art is the sight of the perambulator in the hallway.
Right. So I would come back home and write at night, and I still do. I figured out certain habits. I have a very peculiar writing habits. I like to write in bed. So I would just, essentially, I still do. So I was, when I started my new book, I was now in my new office, and it's a sparkling new office, etc. And for the longest time, I couldn't write at all, and I couldn't figure out why. I kept scratching my head saying, well, why am I having such a writer's block? And I realized it's because there was no bed. So I put a bed in my office.
But that's the secret to writer's block, I think.
So anyway, I mean, the question is, how do you make time? How do you find the time? I just don't know. I don't have a great answer to the question. Is the bottom line. You make time. If you have creative projects, if it's an itch, as you're calling it, time eventually gets manufactured. You just make it. I don't have a genius answer to that, except to say the fact that itches need to be scratched, and when they need to be scratched, they need to be scratched, as you know. And for me, that itch was so important, that was so personal, that was so compulsive, that it had to be scratched. And if that meant staying up the hours in the night to finish a book, it meant staying up the hours to finish a book.
And as you developed the book and thought more about it and I'm sure there were things that, what were the things that surprised you as you scoped out this whole history of this evolution of this multi-headed disease?
Well, I would answer it in two different ways. One of them has to do with the craft of writing books, but the other one has to do with the craft of thinking about science. And they're related, but not the same kind of project. So the craft of thinking about science is that, and you spend your life immersed in the day-to-day. I'm a laboratory scientist. I still like to sit in the laboratory, picking up a pipette and pushing specimens onto other specimens, or mixing solutions with other solutions, or as Charles Lamb called it, making nasty smells. So I think the problem from being a scientist is how to look outwards and backwards. Here you are in the thick of things. You're a sort of soldier in the trenches, as it were. But then you're also asked, you have to be asked, what's the meaning of doing these small activities and you're doing? How do they stretch together and link together? So in other words, science and medicine are fundamentally about storytelling. It's a fundamental task of science and medicine to be able to tell stories. We need those. Every person who's an important scientist, I think, has made important contributions to the world, has the capacity to, I think, to understand those contributions in terms of very formal storytelling. You should be able to tell someone, a layperson, you should be able to describe to yourself what you're doing, why it's important, and how it fits into that history. And so much of the book was learning how to do that and crafting it in a way that was sensible not only to me and to other scientists, creating a roadmap for the future for a problem that I think was of immense importance, but also learning to do that from qua science, learning to do that not only as a nonfiction writer, but learning to do that, creating a roadmap for oneself, saying to myself, what is my story? What is our story? Where are we in this long process? How do we pinpoint the landmark destinations, and how do we move forward? What does the future look like?
Now, had you shown the book to anybody before you finished it, or what was the reaction to the manuscript?
Well, I have an interesting story about interesting story about the process as well. Many people here have written amazing books. You can see a whole you can find a whole curriculum as you walk outside in the hallway. But my process was very unique. I couldn't, for the life of me, and I still cannot, I can't write a book proposal because it seems to be like a simulacrum of the object itself. It's like saying, I'm going to do this, but this is what it's going to look like. And it seemed to be some of an absurd idea, because unless you show what you're doing, I suppose it comes from me being a scientist, unless you show what you're doing, it's sort of empty. It doesn't exist in the real world. So I tried for the longest time. As seriously as possible, I tried to write a book proposal, and it was completely empty. And so one day I decided, this was several years ago, one day I said, I'm just going to start writing. I'm going to start writing. I'm going to begin with the first word. I'm a very linear writer. I don't patch together pieces of books. I start from the first word, and I end in the last word. I said, I'll just start. And when the book was about no less than 300 pages is when I first showed it to people. And the reaction was very binary. It was either you really, really think that someone's going to read a 600-page book about cancer. You sincerely think about that. One editor told me, why don't you write a kind of 3 greatest hits of cancer research? And I said, well, that's not really going to work. I'm sorry. Thank you for playing. But and then eventually, when it grew up to, but the other part of the binary curve was folks like Nan Graham, who has edited all my books, is editing my new books as well, just said, we will make this work in any manner possible. She had edited an amazing book on mental illness, Andrew Solomon's book, called The Noonday Demon. Many of you may have read the book or seen or read the book. And she said that we know how to bring this kind of work into public realm. And I trusted her, and that's what happened.
Yeah, your faith was well placed. Now, would you like to spend a few minutes or a couple of minutes setting up the excerpt from the documentary?
Absolutely,
that we're about to
see? Let me just preface this by saying the book was transformed into the documentary very, very quickly after publication, and it's a reminder of how this sort of the world of books and films, I suspect, works. That people who are interested in these topics read voraciously. Ken Burns reads voraciously. He's a voracious reader, a wonderful reader. And I was sitting in my office, may have been barely a month or 2 months after the book was originally published, and I got a phone call, a cold phone call, which is a reminder you should always pick up your own phone. And it said, I'm Ken Burns. I'm interested in making a film about your book. And I said, I know who you are. And I basically, over the phone, agreed on the spot. I said, absolutely. I've seen every one of Ken's films, starting from Civil War all the way up to, at that time, I think Prohibition had just come out. And I said, this would be an amazing collaboration. No one, as far as I know, had done this kind of project before, using cancer, any disease, we talked about AIDS a little bit, as a lens by which to see human history, or American history in particular. Ken was just the perfect person to bring that challenge up. Okay, so that was the setup. Now going into the clip itself, there were a couple of artistic decisions. So I basically co-wrote the script with several people, mainly with Jeffrey Ward, who led the entire script writing process. But one of the crucial decisions is that even for Ken, it was a departure from the standard format of filmmaking, because here was something that was not just Civil War kind of history. When we first sat down and said, this is also a story of a civil war, except one that happens to be in your own body. It has that kind of resonance for many people, and will for many people in the world. It also needs to be a future roadmap. So that's the second piece of it. But most importantly, there had to be an element in which the historical realm, which Ken is a master at, had to be continued into the current realm. So we thought that we would follow real patients in real time, an incredible generosity on from the standpoint of patients. Would follow them in real time and meld or melt their stories into the larger narrative of the film. This was an incredibly complicated task in terms of filming because we were following people from day zero. We were following people prospectively, and anyone who's done filmmaking, it's an incredible challenge because you don't know what's coming next. There is no story because the story is coming out in front of you, as it were, and you can only script that story in retrospect. So I'm going to show you one clip from the film, which I think we try to do that. I'm not going to set it up anymore because it's going to give parts of it away, but we begin basically with an idea that was formulated in the 1880s about surgery and cancer and the body, really an idea of the body, really an idea that comes to us from the medieval conception of the body. And then we move forward into a real-life case, and the way that these two interact, I think, is an important moment. I should also tell you that this very clip, this very idea, will come back in the film, and as it does in the book, will come back, 4 hours later in the film and the book. The idea of what lengths do we go to, or what lengths can we go to in science and medicine to heal or cure someone? Is there a limit? What does radical mean? What does a radical procedure mean? What does a radical invasion of the body mean if the end point is to try to cure someone? Can you walk them, as it were, into the crucible of dying or near death to come out on the other side having cured or healed someone? And what conviction does that involve? What kind of vulnerabilities and liabilities does that involve, both from patients and doctors, in order to do that? So that's the little bit of the background. I'll start the clip. I'm going to say one last thing, is that even now when I watch the clips are very, very emotionally dense. So I would prep you for that. The only other thing being that when they're stopped, it's sort of impossible to stop, but we have to stop at some point in time. So let's just do that.
Okay.
It rings through the history of cancer over and over again. There is no treatment, there is no treatment, there is no treatment.
In 1855, a young German biologist named Rudolf Virchow stared down the barrel of his microscope and fixed on the honeycomb of structures that made up a sample of tissue. Others had named these structures cells, after the Spartan rooms in which monks lived and prayed. Virchow had a revolutionary theory to explain cells. They were not only the basis of healthy life, but of disease. A cell, he wrote, is the ultimate irreducible form of every living element, and from it emanate all the activities of life, both in health and in sickness.
As he studied cells under the microscope, he came to realize that there wasn't some strange material that made the cells, but that every cell came from a previous cell. Once he pointed out that thesis, omnis cellula e cellula, he called it, every cell from another cell, that changed the understanding of what cancer was. Cancer cells clearly came from cells that weren't cancerous. They clearly came from perfectly normal cells that had been changed.
Virchow's discovery pointed to surgery as the primary treatment for most forms of cancer. If tumors were merely collections of abnormal cells, it should be possible to cut them from the body.
With the advent of anesthesia and antisepsis, with the advent of clean surgery, surgeons could now attack cancer with a real bravado. This is the golden age of cancer surgery.
No one championed surgery with more single-minded purpose than a doctor named William Halsted. Halsted entered the field of medicine in 1868 because he did not want to work in his father's clothing business. Once he'd found surgery, though, he'd found his calling.
He was a dashing, exciting surgeon because of how quick he was. Developed a great reputation in New York City.
From the beginning, Halsted was known for his innovative and complex surgeries. He seemed intent on pushing himself and his patients to the limit.
He is addicted to perfection. He is addicted to the idea that the reason that cancer is not being appropriately treated is because the surgeons aren't trying hard enough. If they only tried more, if they tried better, if they were more perfect, if they could deliver a more perfect operation, then in fact they would cure more. Cutting more meant curing more.
In 1890, Halsted became chief of surgery at the new Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, where he concentrated on patients with breast cancer. As he operated on more and more women, Halsted confronted a puzzle that had long mystified surgeons. Even when the breast was removed, cancer could still reappear in entirely new places in the body. Halsted thought he understood why. He believed that stray cancer cells had escaped at the margins of his incisions. His answer was to cut an ever-widening arc of tissue.
Halsted started with the idea that cancer started in the breast and it grew centrifugally. It grew out from the original cancer. It had roots, it had like tentacles, and that if you could just get widely around it enough, you could get it all out and you could cure it.
And so Halsted got the idea, what if I remove the muscle underneath the breast, and then the muscle underneath that, and then the lymph nodes beyond that? So he was doing this excavation in people's chests. He was really pushing the envelope. How far could you go with your scalpel?
Halsted called his procedure the radical mastectomy. Radical, after the original Latin, by the root. But others took it for the more common meaning, extreme.
From a woman's standpoint, it's horrendous because you're left completely flat. Not only do you not have the breast, but you don't have your pectoralis muscle either, so it's just ribs. And often you don't have a nice fold in your armpit the way you normally do because that muscle's taken as well. And so it's really ugly and very deforming.
Despite the damage they caused, Halsted's radical operations did succeed in saving the lives of many of his patients, whose cancers had not yet spread beyond the breast.
When you think about removing the amount of tissue he's removing and still having decent results, this is not a hack job. People who have described watching Halsted operate speak of it in hushed, reverential tones. It was like watching, a virtuoso violinist or a great pianist. There were very few people who could do what Halsted could do back then. And so every doctor, every surgeon turned their eyes to Baltimore to see what the great Halsted was doing.
But there was a problem with radical surgery, whether it was for cancer in the breast, lung, prostate, or any other organ. No matter how skilled the surgeon or bold the operation, a significant number of patients still relapsed with the disease elsewhere in their bodies, as if the cancer had leapfrogged the surgeon's incisions. Clearly, there was a limit to what surgery could do. Once the cancer had spread, it was too late.
Halsted's approach did work for some patients. It was almost right, but it was not the full answer. And this idea that, you can take half-truths and you make full truths out of them, and then the logic of the field closes, because you say to yourself, this is the truth, and therefore lies outside the boundaries of being testable.
I was 6 or 7 when I saw the show MASH, and it was so exciting, and I felt that that was something that I could do. And my mom was the person who told me that I could do anything. My mom and dad didn't go to college, but When I said I wanted to be a surgeon at 7, they're like, okay, don't worry. I always say that I'm the first generation sort of post-segregation. It was a time that my parents felt that there was opportunity, and so that they had waited a long time. And so it meant for us that there was a lot to accomplish.
Dr. Lori Wilson is a surgical oncologist and the director of the surgery residency program at Howard University.
The fact that you could make a difference in someone's life that actually could save their life. And that, by far, I thought was one of the most dramatic things about surgical oncology.
Dr. Wilson specializes in breast cancer, in research as well as in her practice.
Right now, the important thing is to make sure that you're feeling well and that you're doing well.
Excited.
You're excited and you're nervous, and I know that we can do that to you. Deep breaths. Whenever we know that cancer is the diagnosis, we always want to make sure that we give all sides and that you may not be cured and that your cancer could progress to something that could end your life.
The next couple of weeks, that's fine.
All right, I want to get a quick look, just to examine you real quick to see if I can feel anything so that we can watch as we move forward. Sure. All right.
In July 2013, Dr. Wilson herself was diagnosed with breast cancer.
The first person that I called was my husband. I told him that the diagnosis was cancer, and he said, I'll be right home.
Can you feel anything?
I think the thing that caught me off guard is that I not only have breast cancer on one breast, I actually have breast cancer in both breasts, which is a very unusual way for patients to be diagnosed.
All right, you may go ahead and get dressed, and we'll get you started.
To complicate matters, Lori has a different kind of cancer in each breast. On the right is a particularly aggressive type called triple negative. On the left, the cancer is a type that may be treatable by chemotherapy, but it has already spread to her lymph nodes.
It makes it more difficult to treat, and so the statistics are worse.
You okay? You don't look too happy today.
No, it's just a little weepy today.
It's the fear of the unknown and, wondering what you're getting.
I think one of the difficult parts I'm having is with the totality of the diagnosis. I can process I have breast cancer, but what the long-term impact that may be, I'm having a difficult time sort of processing that. So we're going to do a right thyroid lobectomy. She has that.
Soon after her diagnosis, Lori shared the news with her colleagues and students.
This is one of the assistant chiefs that sent this to me. Why you? I instantly asked myself, but I soon realized that if there is anyone who can attack this situation with the type of strength and faith that is needed, it is you. You give each and every resident that you touch hope, the hope that is needed to resist the urge to quit and to just keep fighting a little more. I know you would do anything for us. But now, the tables turn. It's time for you to watch your commitment pay off. We'll be your soldiers through this battle, from taking a greater role with Mammo Day to extra work of any sort, to becoming the leader that you make us believe we can be. It's done.
So, Sid, give us a bit of perspective here. In your book, you quoted a Fortune magazine cover, I think, from the mid-1930s that
we just need the scientific and political will to move us into the next phase of cancer research and therapy, which we are lacking right now. We know more about how to understand cancer at a molecular and genetic level than we have ever known. Obviously, this is a progressive field, but there is lucidity and clarity about many of the, not all, but many of the fundamental features of a global problem. That lucidity and clarity about mechanism, about understanding what causes and how the causes actually affect themselves in cellular biology, need to be now translated into mechanisms of finding new medicines and prevent and treat cancer, excuse me. And that transition is where we're sitting on right now. And while we're undergoing that transition, we seem to have lost a national and international will to enable that transition politically, financially, and in terms of being able to support research in the longer run. And that's the problem. We could talk very specifically about what we know about cancer today.
Maybe just, compared to 80 years ago, if somebody does get a diagnosis of cancer today, and I know it's an odd way to ask the question, but if you are diagnosed with cancer, what are the better cancers to be diagnosed with?
Well, just to give you one example, let's take a very concrete example. 80 years ago, if you had breast cancer as a woman, Laurie Wilson, to take her example, if you had breast cancer as a woman, the primary modality of treatment may be to hide you away in the attic and not talk about cancer. The secondary modality of treatment might be to refer you to someone like William Stewart Halsted. You travel to Baltimore, come back with an excavation of your chest, be unable to move your right arm or left arm, depending on the circumstances, and really be confined back into the attic because now you were disabled from the surgery itself. Your life may have been saved by that process. 80 years later, we now know we have a host of modalities, beginning from surgery and radiation therapy to remove the primary tumor from the breast, starting next with hormonal therapies, if you happen to have that variant of cancer, that will prevent a relapse of cancer and probably extend your life by 5 to 7 years, followed by a secondary therapy, secondary hormonal therapies, which will again increase your lifespan by 5 to 7 years, followed by long-term surveillance for potential recurrence of disease. Now you could say, well, what does that mean? It means that we think, there's hard numbers to put down, but we think we have extended the lifespan of a woman with locally advanced breast cancer by on the order of 12 to 15 years. So if you were diagnosed at 50 in 1922, you have extended your life by 12 vital years, from 50 to 62. These are reasonable numbers. Hard to know exactly what the numbers are, but these are reasonable numbers. It has also meant that because of the combination of all therapeutics, we have managed to decrease the mortality rate from breast cancer. Mortality rate, as I've discussed in the book, is a very hard number. It's a tough statistic because it's real, unlike diagnosis rates, which seem to increase and decrease depending on how effectively you're diagnosing, et cetera. The mortality rate is a real number, and we've managed to decrease the mortality rate from breast cancer by about 1% every year, starting since the 1980s. And you could say, who cares about 1% every year? Well, it's 24, 25 years since then, and that number has decreased. The mortality rate of breast cancer, age-adjusted, has decreased by about 25 to 30%. That's an amazing accomplishment, and we should be very proud of that accomplishment. In contrast, the mortality rate of locally advanced or metastatic pancreatic cancer has changed 0 in that same period of time. So that is just to give you a sense of the spectrum. The mortality rate of acute lymphoblastic leukemia, children's leukemia, has gone basically from 100% to about 10% in that same span of time, from the 1980s to 2015. 90% of children are cured. They have some long-term complications of that cure, but that gives you some of the spectrum of numbers.
Do you want to talk a little bit about where you've turned your attention more recently and you have 2 new books out, I think one shorter than the other, but to talk about both of those.
I have a small book coming out, a short book coming out. Should never call books small, they get insulted. I have a short book.
But worth every penny.
Exactly, worth every penny, that's right. I have a short book coming out which is called The Laws of Medicine. And it was inspired actually by a book that I read when I was an undergraduate. actually brought me into medicine in the first place, which was Lewis Thomas's astonishing The Youngest Science. Lewis Thomas wrote 2 short books, The Lives of a Cell and The Youngest Science, both of which I recommend to everyone, every medical and other student. I think people in the humanities should read both these books because they're about the future of the future. The Youngest Science was the name of that book, Lewis Thomas's astonishing book, and he wrote about the idea that medicine is the youngest science, following the lineage of physics and chemistry and biology into medicine. And the question that I tried to raise in my new book, which is called The Laws of Medicine, is if medicine is the youngest science, then if all sciences should have laws, what are the laws of medicine? And I'll leave it at that. So you can, it'll be out in October. What are the laws of medicine? Just a teaser is that it turns out that all of them are really laws of uncertainty. They're laws of the ways we manage or practice information under profound uncertainty. And that's to me, one of the most interesting problems of medicine. There's lots of information, there's lots of uncertainty. How do you combine these things together in a way that makes sense for an individual human being? That's I think, and a large part of it, it's an evocation of one of the most important intellectuals of the 20th century who didn't live in the 20th century, named Thomas Bayes, who discovered one of the fundamental laws about how we think about uncertainty, probably one of the most important laws that governs the way we practice economics or stockbrokering. Bayesian statistics, and the book is dedicated to Thomas Bayes.
Now, what about the other book?
So, and then I have another book. The Laws of Medicine was really an essay that was sitting in a drawer for a long time. Someone asked for it, and I said I'd modify the essay, and that's how it became. I'm not writing 2 books at the same time. Please don't, please don't get the wrong impression that I, sort of move from one book to another book, like playing Rachmaninoff or something, like 2 hands. The other book, which I've been working for a while, is A History of the Gene as a 20th century idea. It seems to me that we've arrived at an extraordinary time in the future of identity, in the future of self, in the future of being able to change and understand what our genes mean to ourselves. And we need to take this idea very seriously. It's not to say an absurd thing, which is to say genes explain everything, genes explain, et cetera. It's, all human attributes, but it's to take the idea very, very seriously that there is more in individual genomes than we have ever understood, and that individual genomes govern our sense of self more deeply and more provocatively than we have ever understood, and that manipulating those can therefore cause changes, allow us to intervene on human fate, destiny, and identity in a way that we had not expected. If we are to take that idea seriously, we need to know, just like cancer, we need to know where that idea comes from, how much of it is real, and how much of it's going to happen, how much of this is going to happen in the future. Just to give you one brief sense of how extraordinarily the technology has moved forward, to make a directed change in the human genome. So the human genome has 3 billion letters of DNA. If you were to open it as an encyclopedia, it would read ACGG, TT, JGG, ACTG, GG, CTCG, CG, so forth, for 33 volumes of the entire encyclopedia. So 33 entire encyclopedias stretched out over time. Now, we now have the capacity, based on work done over the last 5 years, we now have the capacity of entering that encyclopedia in a cell and changing 1 letter of that encyclopedia. So we can make one change, we can erase out 1 word or 1 letter in that encyclopedia and switch it for another word. Now you can imagine how powerful that technology could be or would be if used appropriately to cure diseases, complicated genetic diseases, cancer, schizophrenia, autism. But how complicated that same technology can be and will be if that's used to direct it in the wrong ways. To change fate in ways that we never expected to change fate, to change identity in ways we never expected to change identity. So I think it really becomes morally, as well as biologically, evident that we need to really think about how we got here. This is another history that we need to have a reckoning with.
And is this book called The Empress?
I thought a long time about, if you have a title, you can come to me and tell me and I'll give you a prize. The book's not being, I title my books at the end.
And when will it be out?
We're looking for a date. It's done. I'm looking for a public. It's now called, I thought that maybe we should just be given the size of the topic, it would be just called simply The Gene, An Intimate History. And it begins with an evocation of a genetic disease that has affected my own family, which is why it's an intimate history, and it ends with my family. Again, it's a family history. It's about ourselves. It's about myself. I'm thinking April, May, sometime.
Good. I look forward to it. Maybe if we have the lights up, I'm sure there are lots of questions from all of you.
Looking back 100 years after Halsted, it's easy to be horrified by the radical surgery that he pioneered and perhaps perfected in a sense. But I also feel from your book and from the clip that there's a great deal of admiration that you have for Halsted, so that he's really something of a tragic hero. Would you agree with that? And do you feel that in some ways those who are at the forefront of treating patients and conducting research today are perhaps one day also going to be tragic heroes?
Those are very important questions. The quick answer is, of course, every person you really see on this film, including some of the patients who allowed themselves to be exposed in this very vulnerable way, are all tragic heroes. They're heroes first. Their tragedies come later, but they're all tragic heroes. They're very important people. They mark the march of history. If it weren't for them, they would not be marking the march of history. So we know that that's the case. And there's a question that's asked in the middle of the film, which one of the great leukemia doctors, Emil Freireich, who's at Texas, asks very blankly. He invented the therapy that has saved the lives of these 90% leukemic children who would die otherwise. And he says, frankly, at one point of time, I said to myself, how far would you go? What is the limit of how far you'd go with human experimentation? What are the gaps and the guidelines that you have, because you're working on human beings? But on the other hand, there's a capacity to bring alive transformative technologies. There is no simple answer to that question. It's a very case-to-case basis. You have to use your internal moral compasses to guide you through it. But there are also now, as you very well know, we've invented institutions to help us keep those moral compasses at bay. It's a beautiful invention. There's this infrastructure that we've surrounded medicine with. The problem is, of course, that sometimes that infrastructure tips over in the wrong direction and it becomes too self-enclosed. And so the most radical forms of therapy are actually inhibited. And finding that right sweet spot, is an exquisitely important problem, but it's an exquisite problem. There's no formula. And in fact, now that you're talking about it, one piece of the laws of medicine is that, finding that spot.
How will the microbiome data, the recent data, play into future cancer research?
It's interesting idea. The idea being, just to restate the question, how we now know that we now know that although we have a single body, we're actually inhabited by millions of other bodies. The idea being that inside our guts, inside our mouths, there are literally several 100 million bacterial species that are growing with us in a commensal way. These bacterial species grow up during our lifetime. They keep our gut flora populated, and we basically have neglected them for the last 200 years of medicine. And now the question has been raised, could these other things that are living within our bodies, could they play a role in metabolic diseases? Could they play a role in cancer and other questions like that? The field is in its infancy, and there's a lot of hype around it. I think that there's very strong evidence that for metabolic diseases, including obesity and diabetes among them very strongly, that there's a link between gut flora and cancer. And these metabolic diseases. The bigger question is whether, number one, whether there's a link in cancer, and number two, can this become technology? You know, we're all interested in technology. Can this become technology? Can you now manipulate the flora of the gut to try to change the way you become predisposed to diabetes or inflammatory bowel diseases? So these are high in that list. Cancer is a little bit low in that list. You know, mental health, I would say, mental illnesses are relatively lower even on that list, and we just have to go through thoughtfully figuring out all those pieces and figuring out whether there'll be technology that comes out of it.
The question comes about extreme measures, right? When the battle may be almost lost, but there may be more things to do. Who gets to make the decision? Who gets to foot the bill? Who gets to make the moral determination?
Well, so the first answer to the question is, I mean, at least the lodestar answer there is quite obvious. The patient gets to make that decision. So the lodestar answer is the simple answer, right? The lodestar answer is, look, we have a strong line in the sand about who gets to make that decision and how that decision gets to be made. But in fact, that's also a relatively empty answer. In real life, we know anyone who's really experienced any devastating illness knows that, first of all, the idea that the physician is not a paternalistic character is fundamentally flawed. Medicine has always been paternalistic or maternalistic. The gender doesn't matter, but its capacity to stand in for decisions on behalf of other people is undeniable. So we might as well sort of fess up to that idea and confront it. So now that elephant is in the room, we need to we've tried very hard to make this decision consensually and collaboratively. And there's a clear consensus in medicine that, at least within the United States, that decision has moved way, the pendulum has swung quite far in one direction, and we need to find a way to bring it backwards. And by that I mean the following, which is that, you know, we are over-treating many cancer patients. There's a recent, in fact, today there was a striking article in the New York Times of a place in California where they've concentrated on a different model of hospice care. I'd encourage people to read it, which involves kind of a more celebrated death. There are these things called death with dinner conversations that we're having now. Hopefully we'll have in the future, where we can figure out how to make plans for our own demise. Now, that is not to say that we still need to counteract some of the fundamental nihilism that comes with cancer. And if we don't do that, then the technology that allows us to live more fruitful, better, longer lives, but really more fruitful and better lives, more dignified lives, and secondarily longer lives, does not need to be moved forward. It does. There's a long way to go. There are still ways in which we are falling backwards on being able to deliver the correct therapy for a 50-year-old woman with breast cancer. So I think both these conversations need to be carried out at the same time, and we're trying to do that somewhat unsuccessfully.
I have a final question, Sid, since our all too brief time is up, which is just reading your book and thinking about it just a little bit. Is it healthy for anyone who is touched with cancer, acquainted with cancer, or related to somebody confronting the disease, to encourage them when they go to see their doctor to think of themselves as an outlier?
That's an interesting question. You know, this is the famous Garrison Keillor problem, right? So, you know, everyone is an outlier and everyone's above average. So we have a natural tendency to think of ourselves as invincible. The important idea, I think, that's contained in your question, a very important question, is to figure out how deeply or in what context we understand ourselves as outliers. Each one of us is a psychological or psychic outlier. That's because the psyche, identity self, is a unique variant of itself. But on the other hand, we share vast amounts of physiology with each other. In fact, we share vast amounts of physiology with chimpanzees. And with laboratory mice. So there is, of course, a correct answer which tells us that you're not going to be an outlier. In other words, if you expose yourself to certain carcinogens, chances are that you will acquire the cancer caused by those carcinogens, and therefore you're not an outlier in that sense. You may be statistically an outlier because you've smoked all your life, and at 85 you haven't had lung cancer, in which case you're a statistical outlier. We had no tools, and I'll stop right here at the last point. We had no tools 10 years ago to be able to assess these outliers. We didn't have enough tools, we didn't have enough technology, and we look like in this universe.
Well, Sid, on behalf of all of us, thank you very much indeed.